I'm Miranda Angels Hun, 34, and I rose through the ranks to become a decorated officer in the U.S. military. For years, I tried to bridge the gap with my father, showing up, achieving, and hoping he'd be proud. But on the morning of my wedding, he looked me in the eye and said, "You're a disgrace in uniform. Find someone else." That was the moment I made a choice that changed everything. Have you ever been dismissed or humiliated by someone you gave everything to? If so, share your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I tell you what happened, let me know where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to stand tall after being wronged, hit that like button and subscribe for more true stories about setting boundaries and reclaiming your worth. What happened next might surprise you. I learned early that love in my father's house came with conditions. Not the spoken kind, he wasn't cruel enough for ultimatums, but the quiet expectations that hung in the air like cigarette smoke, staining everything they touched. Perfect grades weren't celebrated, they were expected. Clean rooms weren't praised, they were the baseline. And when I told him at 17 that I wanted to serve my country, the silence that followed told me everything I needed to know about where military service ranked in his hierarchy of acceptable life choices. "It's a phase," he told my mother that night, his voice carrying through the thin walls of our ranch house. "She'll grow out of it." But I didn't grow out of it. If anything, his dismissal made the calling stronger. While my classmates spent senior year planning sorority life and shopping for dorm room decorations, I was at the recruiting office, filling out paperwork that would reshape everything I thought I knew about myself. The recruiter, a woman with kind eyes and ribbons across her chest that spoke of places I'd only seen in textbooks, explained what basic training would be like. The physical demands. The mental challenges. The transformation from civilian to soldier. "Your family supportive?" she asked, glancing at the emergency contact section where I'd written my parents' information. I hesitated. They're adjusting to the idea. That was generous. My father had stopped asking about my plans entirely, redirecting conversations toward my younger sister's college applications, or the weather, or anything that didn't involve acknowledging the choice I'd made. He attended my high school graduation, sat in the appropriate seat, clapped at the appropriate moments, but when I crossed the stage and looked into the audience, his eyes were already focused somewhere else. The day I left for basic training, he shook my hand. Not a hug, he wasn't demonstrative that way, but a firm handshake that lasted exactly 3 seconds. "Be careful," he said. 2 words that had to carry the weight of everything else he couldn't or wouldn't say. Basic training broke me down and built me back up, just like they promised. The drill instructors stripped away every civilian comfort, every assumption about what I could or couldn't handle. In the South Carolina heat, surrounded by women who'd come from backgrounds I couldn't imagine, I learned that strength wasn't something you were born with. It was something you chose again and again, especially when choosing it felt impossible. I called home every Sunday during the brief phone privileges. My mother always answered, updating me on neighborhood gossip and my sister's latest achievements. Sometimes my father was there in the background. I could hear the television volume lower, hear his chair creak as he shifted, but he never asked to speak to me. Never asked how I was adjusting. Never acknowledged that his daughter was becoming someone new. "How's Dad?" I asked one Sunday, halfway through the 10-week program. "He's fine," my mother said, which was her standard response to any question that might require her to navigate the complicated territory between her husband and her daughter. "He's proud of you." But pride wasn't the same as support, and I was learning the difference. Pride was something you could feel from a distance, something that didn't require you to change your plans or challenge your assumptions. Support meant showing up, even when showing up was uncomfortable. When I graduated from basic training, they came to the ceremony. My father wore his good suit, the navy one he reserved for weddings and funerals, and he clapped when my name was called. But when I approached them afterward in my dress uniform, I watched his eyes take in the transformation. The posture that had become second nature. The confidence that came from surviving something that had seemed impossible 10 weeks earlier. The pride I felt in wearing something that represented service to something bigger than myself. "You look different," he said. "I feel different," I replied. He nodded, but I could see him cataloging the changes like accountant reviewing expenses. Each difference was something that took me further from the daughter he'd expected to raise, closer to the woman I was choosing to become. Advanced individual training came next, then my first duty station. Each achievement felt like a small victory and a small betrayal. Victory, because I was succeeding in ways that surprised even me. Betrayal, because each success seemed to widen the gap between my father's expectations and my reality. When I made sergeant ahead of schedule, I called to share the news. He congratulated me, but his voice carried the same tone he used for my sister's softball games or my mother's book club achievements. Pleasant but distant. Appropriate but uninvested. "Your father's having trouble adjusting," my mother explained during one of our private conversations. "He worries about you." But worry wasn't the same as respect, and I was learning that difference too. Worry was something you did when you didn't trust someone's judgment. Respect was what you offered when you recognized their capability to make their own choices, even choices you didn't understand. The years passed, and I built a life that had little to do with the person I'd been in his house. I earned commendations. I led teams through training exercises that tested every limit I thought I had. I deployed overseas, sending postcards from places that expanded my understanding of service and sacrifice. Each experience added layers to who I was becoming, but when I came home on leave, I could feel myself shrinking back into old patterns. The daughter who'd learned to navigate his moods. The girl who'd tried so hard to earn something that seemed perpetually just out of reach. "You've seen a lot," he said during one visit, gesturing vaguely at the ribbons on my dress uniform hanging in my old closet. "I have," I agreed. "Must be hard," he added, and for a moment I thought he might ask about the deployment, about what I'd learned or how it had changed me. Instead, he reached for the television remote. "Your sister's got news about her promotion." I learned to celebrate my achievements with the family I'd found in service. My fellow soldiers understood what each ribbon meant, what each promotion represented. They'd earned their own. They knew the weight of responsibility that came with rank, the pride of wearing something that connected you to generations of men and women who'd chosen service over comfort. But a part of me, the part that still remembered being 17 and hoping for his approval, kept expecting him to recognize what I'd built. Kept hoping he'd see past his own discomfort with my choices to the person those choices had helped me become. Kept believing that eventually, his love for me would outweigh his disappointment in the path I'd taken. That hope would carry me all the way to my wedding day, when I'd learn exactly how much his approval was worth. The comments started subtly, the way most family poison does. Not direct confrontation, my father wasn't built for those kinds of conversations, but sideways observations that landed like paper cuts. Small enough to seem accidental. Sharp enough to draw blood. "Interesting career choice," he'd say when people asked about my service at family gatherings. "Not traditional, but interesting." Traditional. The word carried weight in his vocabulary, like a stamp of approval he wasn't willing to give. Traditional was my sister's teaching job, her suburban house, her husband who worked in insurance and wore ties to church on Sunday. Traditional wasn't the life I was building, one deployment and promotion at a time. The engagement should have been a bridge between us. When Andrew proposed, a fellow officer who understood the demands of service, who'd earned his father's respect through shared experience in ways I apparently couldn't, I thought maybe this would be the moment my father saw me as something other than a disappointment in uniform. A wedding meant traditions he could recognize. Ceremonies that followed patterns he understood. "When are you thinking?" my mother asked when I called to share the news. I could hear her already planning, the excitement in her voice that came from having a project that made sense in her world. "Next spring," I said. "We want something simple. Meaningful." "Your father will want to walk you down the aisle," she said, as if this was obvious. As if the past decade of distance could be bridged by a single ceremonial gesture. But when I brought it up during my next visit home, his response wasn't the immediate yes I'd hoped for. Instead, he got that look, the one that meant he was calculating something I couldn't see. "We'll talk about it closer to the date," he said. Closer to the date became his standard response to any wedding-related question. Would he be giving a toast? "We'll talk about it." Did he have opinions about the venue? "We'll talk about it." Would he like to help with planning? "We'll talk about it closer to the date." But he was talking, just not to me. I started noticing the conversations that stopped when I entered rooms. The way certain family friends looked at me with something that felt like pity. The comments that felt designed to probe rather than celebrate. Military weddings are so formal, his sister mentioned during a birthday party, her tone suggesting this was somehow unfortunate. All those uniforms. It's what they know, my father replied, and I could hear years of accumulated frustration in those 4 words. What we knew. As if our service was something foreign, something that had pulled us away from real life rather than deeper into it. As if the discipline that had shaped us into leaders was somehow a limitation rather than a strength. Andrew noticed it too. He's not comfortable with who you've become, he said after a particularly tense family dinner where my father had spent most of the evening talking to everyone except the 2 people who were supposedly the guests of honor. He's my father, I said, as if that explained anything. As if biology could overcome a decade of feeling like a stranger in my own family. That doesn't mean he gets to treat you like you're less than, Andrew replied. You've earned more respect than this. But earning and receiving were different things, and I was learning that respect couldn't be demanded, even when it was deserved. Even when the alternative was watching someone you'd once looked up to become smaller in your estimation with each passing conversation. The breaking point came 6 weeks before the wedding, during what should have been a routine planning call. My mother was going through logistics, flowers, seating arrangements, the timeline for photographs. Normal wedding stress that felt manageable until she got to the ceremony itself. Your father's been talking to Pastor Mitchell about the service, she said. He has some concerns about the military elements. Concerns. Another word that carried weight in our family's vocabulary. Concerns meant disapproval dressed up as thoughtfulness. Concerns meant he'd been having conversations about my wedding that didn't include me. What kind of concerns? I asked. My mother's pause told me everything I needed to know about how difficult this conversation was going to be. He thinks it might be too much. The uniforms. The sword ceremony. He's worried it won't feel like a real wedding. A real wedding. As if the ceremony Andrew and I had planned, honoring both our family's traditions and our military service, was somehow artificial. As if the vows we'd written, the community we'd built, the love we'd found weren't real because they existed within the context of our chosen profession. What does that mean, exactly? I asked. He just wants it to feel like home, my mother said. Like family. But home was the base where I'd built my career. Family was the unit I'd served with overseas, the people who'd stood beside me when standing felt impossible. Family was Andrew, who understood what it meant to choose service, who'd seen me at my strongest and my most vulnerable and loved both versions. My father's version of family required me to be smaller. Required me to downplay the parts of myself that made him uncomfortable. Required me to pretend that the life I'd built was somehow less significant than the one he'd imagined for me 17 years earlier. I need to talk to him, I said. Maybe wait until you're home next week, my mother suggested. These conversations are better in person. But I could already feel myself preparing for disappointment. Could already hear the carefully worded objections, the concerns that weren't really concerns, but ultimatums dressed in softer language. Could already see the choice he was going to force me to make between honoring him and honoring myself. The conversation, when it finally happened, would be worse than I imagined. But sitting in my apartment that night, looking at the wedding dress hanging in my closet, I had no idea how completely he was preparing to break my heart. He chose the morning of my wedding to destroy me. Not the weeks leading up to it, when there might have been time to adjust, to find alternatives, to process the rejection in private. Not during the rehearsal dinner, when the wound could have been bandaged with sleep and last-minute logistics. He waited until the morning when I was most vulnerable, most hopeful, most convinced that maybe, despite everything, he'd find a way to show up for me when it mattered most. I was in the bridal suite at the hotel, surrounded by the controlled chaos of final preparations. My maid of honor was steaming my dress. The photographer was capturing candid moments that would later seem surreal in their normalcy. My mother was managing the timeline with military precision that would have made my drill instructors proud. Everything was moving according to plan, exactly as we'd rehearsed. Then he knocked on the door. "Can I have a moment with my daughter?" he asked, and the room cleared instantly. The women who'd been bustling around me suddenly found reasons to be elsewhere, sensing something in his tone that made them want to avoid whatever was coming next. We stood there in the empty suite, me in my robe and him in his suit, and for a second I let myself believe this might be one of those father-daughter moments people write about. The private blessing before the ceremony. The emotional conversation where years of distance finally get bridged by the significance of the day. Instead, he looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not disappointment, I knew that look well. Not frustration or confusion or any of the emotions that had defined our relationship for the past decade. This was something colder. Something final. "I can't do it," he said. The words hung in the air like smoke. "Do what?" I asked, though part of me already knew. "Walk you down the aisle. I can't be part of the circus." Circus. The wedding we'd planned with such care, the ceremony that honored both our family's traditions and our military service, reduced to a spectacle he couldn't bear to participate in. "Dad," I started, but he held up a hand. "You want to play soldier, that's your choice. But I won't be part of the performance. Find someone else to walk you down that aisle, because I won't be doing it." The cruelty was breathtaking. Not just the rejection, but the timing. Not just the words, but the way he delivered them, clinical, final, designed to cause maximum damage with minimal effort. He'd had months to have this conversation. Months to express his concerns, to try to find middle ground, to figure out a way to support his daughter even if he couldn't support her choices. Instead, he'd waited until the moment when I had no options except to absorb the blow and keep moving. "You're a disgrace in uniform," he added, and those words hit differently than everything that had come before. Not just personal disappointment, but professional dismissal. Not just a father rejecting his daughter's choices, but a man rejecting everything I'd worked to become. I felt something shift inside me then. Not breaking. I'd been prepared for some version of this conversation for months. But a door closing. A final understanding that the father I'd spent years trying to please didn't actually exist. Had maybe never existed. "Okay," I said. He seemed surprised by my composure. Maybe he'd expected tears, or pleading, or some desperate attempt to change his mind. Instead, I felt eerily calm. The kind of calm that comes after years of preparation for a moment you'd hoped would never arrive. "Okay," he repeated. "You've made your position clear," I said. "I understand." He shifted uncomfortably, and I realized he'd expected more drama. Had maybe wanted more drama, wanted evidence that his rejection could still wound me the way his approval had once mattered. Instead, he was looking at a woman who'd learned to find strength in places he'd never thought to look. "The music starts in 20 minutes, he said, as if I didn't know the timeline of my own wedding. "Then I should finish getting ready," I replied. He left without another word, and I sat down heavily on the chair where I'd been having my makeup done an hour earlier. In the mirror, I could see my reflection, half-finished, vulnerable, but not broken. Behind me, the wedding dress hung perfectly pressed and ready. Around me, the flowers we'd chosen filled the air with something that smelled like hope. My maid of honor knocked softly before entering. "Everything okay?" she asked. "My father won't be walking me down the aisle," I said. Melissa had been through 2 deployments with me, had seen me handle crises that would have broken civilians, had watched me lead soldiers through situations where leadership meant the difference between life and death. She knew I didn't break easily. "What do you need?" she asked. That was the question, wasn't it? What did I need in this moment when everything I'd planned had just shifted? When the gesture that was supposed to represent my father's blessing and support had been stripped away 2 hours before the ceremony, I looked at myself in the mirror again. At the woman who'd earned her rank through discipline and sacrifice. Who'd led teams through challenges that tested every assumption about what was possible. Who'd built a life that had meaning and purpose, even if it wasn't the life her father had imagined for her. "I need to finish getting ready," I said. "And then I need to walk down that aisle and marry the man I love." "Alone?" Melissa asked gently. "If that's what it takes," I replied. But I was wrong about walking alone. In 30 minutes, I'd discover that sometimes the people who show up for you are the ones you least expect. Sometimes family isn't about blood, but about choosing to stand beside someone when standing beside them matters most. The revelation hit me in layers, like aftershocks following an earthquake. First, the immediate impact of his rejection, sharp, breathtaking, designed to leave marks. Then, the deeper understanding of what those words represented. Not just disappointment in my choices, but complete dismissal of the woman those choices had helped me become. I sat in that bridal suite, staring at my reflection while Melissa finished my makeup with hands steadier than mine, and felt something I hadn't expected: relief. Not the kind I'd hoped for, the relief of finally earning his approval, but the relief of finally understanding where we stood. No more waiting for him to see me clearly. No more hope that the next achievement, the next milestone, the next attempt to bridge our differences would be the one that worked. He'd looked at everything I'd built and called it a disgrace. Had reduced a decade of service, leadership, and growth to playing soldier. Had chosen the morning of my wedding, when I was most vulnerable, most hopeful, to make sure I understood exactly how little my choices meant to him. He's been planning this, I said aloud, the realization forming as I spoke. This wasn't a last-minute decision. He's been building toward this moment. Melissa paused with the lipstick halfway to my face. What do you mean? The comments over the past few months. The concerns about the military elements of the ceremony. The way he kept deflecting conversations about wedding planning. I could see the pattern now, could trace the deliberate steps he'd taken to position himself for this rejection. He wanted maximum impact. It wasn't enough to simply decline to participate. He needed me to feel the full weight of his disappointment, needed me to understand that choosing service over his approval came with consequences. The timing wasn't accidental, it was strategic. Cruel in a way that spoke to calculation rather than emotion. What kind of father does that to his daughter? Melissa asked. The question hung in the air between us. I'd been asking myself variations of it for years, but never quite so directly. What kind of father watches his daughter excel in a demanding career and calls it playing? What kind of father takes pride in appearances but not in substance? What kind of father waits until his daughter's wedding morning to deliver maximum emotional damage? The kind who needs control more than connection, I said finally. And there it was, the truth I'd been dancing around for years. This wasn't about my career choices or his discomfort with military life. This was about power. About a man who'd built his identity around being the authority in his family, who couldn't adapt when one of his children chose a path that put her beyond his control. Every achievement I'd earned had been evidence of my independence. Every promotion had been proof that I didn't need his approval to succeed. Every deployment had been a reminder that I'd found purpose and meaning in places he couldn't reach. I'd become someone who didn't require his validation, and that threatened everything he thought he knew about how families were supposed to work. The irony wasn't lost on me. He'd taught me to be strong, to be self-reliant, to work for what I wanted rather than waiting for it to be handed to me. Then he'd punish me for becoming exactly the kind of person those lessons had been designed to create. 5 minutes until we start loading the wedding party, the wedding coordinator announced through the door. I looked at myself one final time in the mirror. The dress fit perfectly. The flowers were exactly what Andrew and I had chosen together. The makeup couldn't hide the fact that I'd been crying, but it also couldn't hide the strength that had carried me through worse moments than this. You don't have to walk alone, Melissa said quietly. My dad would be honored to step in. Or my brother. Or any of the officers from your unit who are here. I considered the options. All generous offers from people who cared about me, who wanted to fill the gap my father had torn open. But they all felt like solutions to someone else's problem. Like admissions that his rejection had the power to diminish what Andrew and I were celebrating. No, I said. If I'm walking without him, I'm walking as myself. Melissa nodded, understanding something in my tone that meant the conversation was closed. She handed me my bouquet, white roses mixed with something blue that represented loyalty and something borrowed that connected me to the women who'd supported me through every significant moment of my adult life. Ready? She asked. I took a breath, felt the weight of the dress, the significance of the moment, the presence of everyone who'd chosen to be here for Andrew and me. In the distance, I could hear the musicians beginning the processional. Could picture Andrew waiting at the altar, probably wondering what was taking so long. Could imagine the guests settling into their seats, expecting a traditional ceremony that would now be anything but. Ready, I said. But I was wrong about walking alone. In the next few minutes, I'd learn that sometimes the people who show up for you are the ones whose respect you've earned rather than inherited. Sometimes family isn't about shared blood, but about shared values. Sometimes the person who stands beside you when standing beside you requires courage is exactly the person you need. The music started. I stepped toward the door that would take me to the beginning of my new life, not knowing that I was about to receive a gift I hadn't known I needed. I stepped into the chapel doorway and felt every eye in the room turn toward me. This was supposed to be the moment of transition, daughter to wife, past to future, family name to chosen family. Instead, it became something else entirely, a moment when I learned exactly who I was when everything familiar fell away. The music swelled, beautiful and traditional, and exactly what we'd chosen together. Andrew stood at the altar in his dress uniform, and even from the back of the chapel I could see his smile, could feel his steadiness reaching across the distance between us. This was what mattered. This moment, this choice, this commitment we were making to build something together. I lifted my chin, straightened my shoulders, and took the first step down the aisle alone. The walk felt both endless and instantaneous. Each step deliberate, measured, carrying me toward the life I'd chosen rather than the one that had been chosen for me. I could see faces in the congregation, Andrew's family, my colleagues from the base, friends who'd served beside me in places that tested everything we thought we knew about ourselves. People who'd shown up because they believed in what we were celebrating. I could also see my father, sitting in the front row with my mother and sister, his face carefully blank in the way that meant he was working hard to control his expression. Not shame, exactly, but something close to it. The recognition that his absence from this moment was visible to everyone, that his rejection was being witnessed by people whose opinions mattered to him. Halfway down the aisle, I heard it, the crisp sound of dress shoes on hardwood, measured and familiar. Military bearing, unmistakable even without looking. Someone had stood up behind me and was matching my pace, following me toward the altar. I didn't turn around. Didn't pause or acknowledge the sound except to feel something shift in my chest. Someone was choosing to stand with me in this moment, not because I'd asked, but because they understood what the moment required. The whispers started rippling through the congregation. A sound like wind through leaves, quiet but persistent. I could feel the energy in the room change from uncomfortable sympathy to something else entirely. Anticipation. Recognition. Respect. 3 steps from the altar, Colonel Martinez appeared beside me. Not hurrying to catch up, not making a scene, but simply present. Taking his place beside me as if he'd always been meant to be there. He was my commanding officer, a decorated war hero whose ribbons told stories of service that had shaped him into the kind of leader other leaders looked up to. He was also, in that moment, exactly the father figure I'd needed without knowing I needed him. He offered his arm without a word, and I took it without hesitation. Together, we covered the final steps to where Andrew waited, and I felt something I hadn't expected: completeness. Not because I'd needed someone to fill my father's role, but because I'd found someone who understood the significance of what that role should represent. Colonel Martinez placed my hand in Andrew's with the gravity the moment deserved. "It's an honor," he said quietly, words meant for both of us, but carrying enough weight for everyone in the chapel to feel. Andrew's eyes were bright with understanding and something that looked like fierce pride. He knew what this gesture meant, knew the courage it had taken Colonel Martinez to step forward, knew the message it sent about the family we'd found in service. "Thank you, sir," Andrew said, and the formality carried none of the distance it might have in other circumstances. This was respect between soldiers, recognition between men who understood what it meant to serve something larger than themselves. I turned back toward the congregation before the ceremony began, ostensibly to hand my bouquet to Melissa, but really to see my father's face. He was pale, his carefully controlled expression replaced by something raw. Shock, perhaps. Or the recognition that his rejection hadn't diminished me, it had revealed the kind of respect I'd earned from people whose opinions were based on merit rather than biology. The ceremony itself was beautiful, traditional vows mixed with military customs that honored both our families and our service. When we exchanged rings, Colonel Martinez stood at attention beside us, his presence a reminder that family could be chosen as well as inherited. When we kissed as husband and wife, the applause felt like more than celebration, it felt like vindication. During the recessional, as Andrew and I walked back down the aisle together, I caught my father's eye one more time. He was looking at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not disappointment or disapproval, but something that might have been the beginning of understanding. Too late, certainly. Too little, definitely. But perhaps the first crack in whatever wall he'd built between us. Later, during the reception, Colonel Martinez approached me while I was talking with some of my former unit members. "Congratulations, Major," he said, using my rank in a way that reminded everyone within earshot of what I'd achieved. "Thank you for what you did today, sir," I replied. "It meant more than you know." He nodded, then looked toward where my father was standing with a small group of relatives, looking isolated in a way that suggested he was finally beginning to understand the consequences of his choices. "Respect is earned," Colonel Martinez said quietly. "And you've earned more than most. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." The reception continued around us, dancing, toasts, celebration of the life Andrew and I were beginning together. But that moment of recognition from someone whose respect meant everything to me felt like the real ceremony. The official acknowledgement that I'd become exactly who I was supposed to be, regardless of who had chosen to witness that transformation. The phone call came 3 days after we returned from our honeymoon. I was unpacking, sorting through gifts and cards, settling back into the routine of married life when my mother's number appeared on the screen. Her voice carried that careful neutrality she'd perfected over the years, the tone that meant she was navigating dangerous emotional territory. "Your father wants to talk," she said without preamble. I continued folding the silk scarf we'd bought in Rome, taking time to consider my response. 3 days. He'd waited 3 days after his public humiliation to decide he wanted to have a conversation. 3 days to let the reality of what had happened at the wedding settle into something he could live with. "About what?" I asked. "He thinks maybe things got out of hand. He wants to clear the air." Clear the air. As if what had happened was a misunderstanding rather than a deliberate choice. As if his rejection of me on my wedding morning was something that could be explained away with the right combination of words and carefully constructed regret. "Put him on," I said. The pause stretched long enough that I wondered if he'd changed his mind. Then his voice came through the line, gruffer than usual, carrying the weight of someone who wasn't accustomed to being in the wrong. "That was quite a scene at your wedding," he said. A scene. Not his rejection of his daughter, not his refusal to participate in one of the most important moments of my life, but my response to that rejection. The way I'd handled his abandonment had become the problem, not the abandonment itself. "Yes, it was," I agreed. "You embarrassed me," he continued. Having that officer step in like that, making it look like I wasn't good enough to walk my own daughter down the aisle. The complaint was so perfectly backward that I actually laughed. Not with humor, but with the recognition that even now, even after everything that had happened, he couldn't see past his own wounded pride to understand what he'd done. "You weren't there to walk me down the aisle," I pointed out. "You refused, remember?" I explained my position. "You chose to make it into something bigger than it needed to be." His position. As if calling me a disgrace in uniform was a reasonable stance that deserved respect rather than the cruel judgment it had been. As if telling me to find someone else was a minor disagreement rather than a fundamental rejection. "What exactly did you expect me to do?" I asked. "Cancel the wedding? Stand there alone and let everyone see that my father couldn't be bothered to show up for me? You could have postponed things. Given us time to work it out." Work it out. After 10 years of him dismissing my career, questioning my choices, treating my service like an embarrassing hobby I'd eventually grow out of, he thought we could work it out in the space between the morning of my wedding and the ceremony itself. "There was nothing to work out," I said. "You made your feelings clear. You think I'm a disgrace. You didn't want to be associated with my choices." I accepted that and moved forward. "You didn't have to make such a production of it," he said, and I could hear the real complaint underneath his words. Not that I'd been hurt, but that his hurt had been witnessed. Not that he'd rejected me, but that his rejection had been seen by people whose opinions mattered to him. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, him circling around various versions of the same theme, that I'd overreacted, that I'd embarrassed him, that the whole situation could have been handled differently if I'd just been more reasonable. Never an acknowledgement of what his words had cost me. Never an apology for the timing or the cruelty. Never recognition that his daughter had earned something better than his dismissal. I think we should maintain some distance for a while, I said when he finally ran out of complaints. Don't be dramatic, he replied. We're family. Family shows up for each other, I said. Family finds ways to support each other even when they don't understand the choices being made. Family doesn't wait until the most vulnerable moment to deliver the deepest cuts. You're being oversensitive. I'm being realistic, I corrected. You've made it clear how you feel about my life, my career, my choices. I'm accepting that and adjusting our relationship accordingly. The silence that followed told me he hadn't expected this response. Had expected me to absorb his criticism, accept his version of events, and return to the dynamic we'd maintained for years, him disapproving, me trying harder to earn something he'd never been willing to give. You're my daughter, he said finally. Yes, I agreed. But that's not enough anymore. Being your daughter doesn't mean accepting disrespect. It doesn't mean tolerating cruelty. It doesn't mean pretending that biology gives you permission to diminish everything I've worked to become. I hung up before he could respond, and in the silence that followed, I felt something I hadn't expected. Peace. Not the peace of reconciliation, but the peace of finally accepting reality. My father was who he was, and who he was didn't include the capacity to see me clearly or support me unconditionally. Andrew found me in our bedroom an hour later, still sitting with the phone in my hand. How did it go? He asked. It went exactly how I expected, I replied. He's not sorry. He's not wrong. And he's not going to change. Andrew sat beside me on the bed we'd chosen together, in the house we'd bought together, in the life we'd built together. I'm sorry, he said. I'm not, I replied, and realized I meant it. I spent years hoping he'd become the father I needed. Now I can stop hoping and focus on the family I actually have. He took my hand, the one wearing the ring that symbolized our choice to build something better than what we'd inherited. Our family, he said. Our family, I agreed, and felt the truth of it settle into something solid and permanent. 2 years passed before he tried again. 2 years of limited contact, strained holiday phone calls that lasted exactly long enough to satisfy my mother's need for family harmony. 2 years of birthday cards with generic messages and Christmas gifts that showed he'd been shopping for a stranger. 2 years of him learning what it felt like to be held at arm's length by the daughter he'd spent a decade taking for granted. I'd built something beautiful in those 2 years. Andrew and I had found our rhythm as a married couple, supporting each other through deployments and promotions, and the 1,000 small challenges that came with military life. I'd earned another commendation, led a training exercise that had been written up in military publications, and been selected for a prestigious assignment that would have made headlines in the local paper if anyone had bothered to tell them. My father hadn't asked about any of it. The second attempt at reconciliation came through my mother, the way most difficult conversations in our family did. She called on a Tuesday evening while I was reviewing personnel files, her voice carrying that familiar tension that meant she was about to ask for something she wasn't sure I'd give. Your father's been thinking, she said. I set down the file I'd been reading and leaned back in my chair. About what? He misses you. He wants to try to rebuild things between you two. Rebuild. As if what we'd had before was worth reconstructing rather than something that needed to be built from scratch, on a foundation that could actually support the weight of who I'd become. What does that look like? I asked. He was hoping you might come to dinner. Just the family. Nothing formal, nothing complicated. Just a chance to spend time together. I considered the offer. Part of me, the part that still remembered being 7 years old and thinking my father could fix anything, wanted to believe that maybe he'd spent the past 2 years thinking about what had happened. Maybe he developed some understanding of why his words had cut so deep, why his timing had been so cruel, why his rejection had felt like such a fundamental betrayal. Did he ask you to call me? I said. The pause told me everything I needed to know about who had initiated this conversation. He's not good with these kinds of conversations, my mother said. You know that. But he cares about you. Caring wasn't the same as respecting, and I'd learned that distinction too clearly to ignore it now. Caring was what you felt for someone from a distance. Respect was what you offered when you took the time to understand who they actually were. If he wants to have dinner, he can call me himself, I said. He's proud, my mother replied, as if this was explanation enough for 2 years of distance. So am I said. The call came 3 days later. His voice on the phone sounded older, rougher around the edges in a way that suggested the past 2 years hadn't been as easy for him as I'd imagined. "Your mother says you might be willing to have dinner," he said. Not an invitation, exactly. More like a confirmation of something he hoped might be true. Even now, even when he was supposedly reaching out, he couldn't bring himself to make the gesture that required him to risk rejection. "I'm willing to have a conversation," I said. "But not at the house. Somewhere neutral." We settled on a restaurant downtown, the kind of place where the lighting was soft enough to hide discomfort and the noise level high enough to prevent conversations from carrying to nearby tables. I arrived first, chose a table in the back corner where we'd have privacy for whatever was about to unfold. He looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, he was still the imposing figure who'd shaped my childhood, but diminished somehow. The kind of smaller that came from spending 2 years discovering that the world didn't reshape itself around your expectations. "You look good," he said, settling into the chair across from me. "Thank you," I replied, though I noticed he didn't mention the uniform I was wearing. Still couldn't bring himself to acknowledge the thing that had driven the wedge between us. We ordered drinks and made small talk about the weather, the restaurant, safe topics that required no real engagement. I could see him working up to something, choosing his words carefully in a way that suggested he'd rehearsed this conversation. "I've been thinking about the wedding," he said finally. "Have you? Maybe I could have handled things differently." Maybe. Could have. The language of someone who was testing the water rather than diving in. Someone who wanted to gauge my reaction before committing to any particular version of regret. "How so?" I asked. The timing wasn't ideal. I should have brought up my concerns earlier, given us more time to work through them. Concerns again. Still not willing to call his rejection what it had been, a fundamental dismissal of everything I'd worked to become. Still framing it as a difference of opinion rather than an act of cruelty. "What were your concerns exactly?" I asked. He shifted in his seat, uncomfortable with the directness of the question. "I wanted your wedding to feel like home. Like family. All the military ceremony made it feel like something else." "It felt like me," I said. "It felt like the life Andrew and I had built together, the community we'd found, the values that shaped us. It felt like who we actually are rather than who you wished we were." "You're still my daughter," he said. "Yes, but I'm not the daughter you wanted me to be. And I need you to understand that I'm not going to apologize for that anymore." The conversation continued for another hour, circling around the same fundamental disconnect. He wanted me to acknowledge that I'd overreacted, that I'd made things more difficult than they needed to be. I needed him to understand that his rejection had been about more than wedding logistics. It had been about respect, about acceptance, about the basic requirement that families show up for each other even when showing up was uncomfortable. We didn't find common ground that night. What we found was clarity. He was never going to see my service as anything more than a phase I'd grown too attached to. I was never going to accept being diminished for choices that had shaped me into someone I was proud of being. But we also found something else, the possibility of a relationship based on reality rather than hope. Not the father-daughter bond I'd once imagined, but something honest. Something limited but genuine. Something that acknowledged who we actually were rather than who we wished we could be. When we left the restaurant, he didn't hug me goodbye. But he shook my hand with something that felt like respect, even if it wasn't the kind of respect I'd once hoped for. "Take care of yourself," he said. "I will," I replied, and meant it. 5 years after the wedding, I received a letter that changed everything I thought I knew about redemption. Not my father's redemption. That story had already been written, its limitations clearly defined, but my own. The understanding that healing doesn't always look like reconciliation, and strength doesn't always require forgiveness. The letter came from Colonel Martinez, written on official stationery, but with a personal tone that made it clear this wasn't routine correspondence. He was retiring after 30 years of service, and he wanted me to know that walking me down the aisle that day remained one of the proudest moments of his career. "You showed every person in that chapel what dignity looks like under pressure," he wrote. "You demonstrated that grace isn't about having everything go according to plan. It's about how you respond when the plan falls apart." That lesson has stayed with me, and I've shared your story with countless young officers who needed to understand that leadership sometimes means standing alone until the right people choose to stand with you. My story. I'd never thought of that day as a story worth telling, but Colonel Martinez had been sharing it, using it as an example of how to handle betrayal without losing your integrity, how to face rejection without accepting diminishment, how to build something beautiful even when the people you'd hoped would help you choose to walk away instead. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, the same day I learned I'd been selected for promotion to lieutenant colonel. The timing felt significant, like the universe's way of connecting the girl who'd walked down the aisle alone with the woman who'd built a career on her own terms. Andrew found me that evening sitting on our back porch, the letter in one hand and my promotion orders in the other. We'd bought the house 2 years earlier, a small place with a big yard where we could host barbecues for our unit, where visiting family could stay when they came to see us, where we could build the kind of home that reflected our values rather than our obligations. Good news or complicated news? He asked, settling into the chair beside me. Both, I said, handing him the letter. Colonel Martinez is retiring. He wrote to tell me about the impact that day had on his perspective about leadership. Andrew read the letter twice, then looked at me with an expression I'd learned to recognize over our years together. Pride mixed with something deeper. The understanding that we'd weathered something that could have broken us and had emerged stronger for the experience. He's right, Andrew said. That day changed how I think about courage too. Watching you handle your father's rejection, seeing you walk down that aisle with your head high, it showed me what real strength looks like. We sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the neighborhood we'd made our own. Around us, the sounds of other families, children playing, barbecues firing up, conversations carrying across backyards, reminded me of everything we'd built. Not just our marriage, but our community, our chosen family, our place in something larger than ourselves. Any word from your father lately? Andrew asked. I shook my head. Birthday card last month. Christmas gift that showed he'd bought it online without much thought. The usual. Our relationship had settled into something predictable over the past few years. Polite but distant. Careful but not cruel. He'd learned to avoid topics that might spark conflict, and I'd learned to accept the limited version of connection he was capable of offering. It wasn't what either of us had once hoped for, but it was honest. It was sustainable. It was enough. Do you think he'll ever understand what he lost? Andrew asked. I considered the question. My father had lost access to my achievements, my struggles, my growth as a person and a leader. He'd chosen his discomfort with my choices over his relationship with his daughter, and that choice had cost him years of connection he could never recover. But understanding loss and accepting responsibility for it were different things. Understanding required the kind of self-reflection my father had never been particularly good at. It required acknowledging that his expectations had been more important to him than his daughter's happiness, that his approval had come with conditions that made it worthless. I don't think it matters whether he understands, I said finally. What matters is that I understand. I understand that I can't make someone respect me who's determined not to. I understand that love without acceptance isn't enough. I understand that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is protect yourself from people who can't see your worth. Colonel Martinez's letter had reminded me of something I'd known intellectually but needed to feel emotionally. That day at the wedding hadn't been about my father's failure. It had been about my success. My ability to handle betrayal without betraying myself. My refusal to let someone else's limitations define my possibilities. You know what the best part of his letter was? I said to Andrew. What? He called it my story. All these years, I've been thinking about that day as something that happened to me. Something I survived. But he's right, it's my story. The story of a woman who walked down the aisle alone and discovered she didn't need anyone else's validation to know her own worth. Andrew reached for my hand, the one wearing the ring that had symbolized our beginning. And the promotion? He asked. I smiled, feeling the weight of the new rank that would bring new responsibilities, new challenges, new opportunities to lead. Lieutenant Colonel. The promotion ceremony is in 6 weeks. Think you'll invite your family? I considered it. The old me would have extended the invitation despite everything, would have hoped that maybe this achievement would be the one that finally earned his respect. But the woman I'd become understood that respect couldn't be earned from someone who was determined not to give it. I'll invite the family that shows up for me, I said. The family that celebrates my achievements instead of tolerating them. The family that sees my service as honor instead of embarrassment. Colonel Martinez. The officers I'd served with. The soldiers I'd led. Andrew's family, who'd embraced me from the beginning. The friends who'd stood beside us through deployments and moves, and all the challenges that came with choosing a life of service. That was my family. Had always been my family. The wedding day when I'd walked alone had been the beginning of understanding that family wasn't about blood, it was about choice. About showing up. About standing beside someone when standing beside them required courage. In 6 weeks, I'd walk across another stage to accept another symbol of achievement. This time, I wouldn't be surprised by who showed up and who didn't. This time, I'd be surrounded by people who understood what the moment meant, who celebrated the woman I'd become rather than mourning the daughter I'd never been. This time, I wouldn't be walking alone. And that's how the man who raised me walked away, and the leader who'd mentored me stepped in without hesitation. It taught me that family isn't always about blood, it's about who shows up when it matters most. Have you ever had someone you love refuse to stand by you, only to be lifted up by someone you never expected? How did it change the way you see loyalty and respect? Share your story in the comments, I read every one. And if you believe in standing your ground and surrounding yourself with people who value you, hit that like button and subscribe for more true stories like this.